Hi there. My name is Dr. Katelyn Jones, and I'm going to be delivering this presentation, AI and Social Impact, Expanding What We Measure and Why. Before diving in, I just want to say a little bit to introduce myself. So, I am the founder and CEO of Noetic, which is an advisory practice focused on supporting senior and C suite level leaders on building the decision infrastructures they need to connect their biggest bets. So, their investments in things like AI and other strategic initiatives to the outcomes they care about most. And in the last couple of years, a lot of this work has focused on supporting leaders in thinking about how to use AI strategically with attention to its broader consequences for their workforce, the communities they work in, and the world more broadly. I also teach decision strategy to MBA students in Loyola University of Chicago's Baumhart program, and I'm board chair at Joel Hall Dancers and Center. So let's dive right on into this presentation today. As I'm sure you all know, listening to this presentation, artificial intelligence is everywhere. And as it rapidly evolves, we are continuing to learn about its benefits and its harms. So, for example, let me go to the next slide. Um, when we look at the environment, it's well documented that AI is affecting water consumption and electricity demand. And at the same time, some of the most impactful applications of AI are actually in the climate space, with social impact focused companies leveraging AI to reduce environmental damage by doing things like tracking methane emissions to support reductions in greenhouse gases. There's also a lot of conversation happening with respect to critical thinking. So, how AI is affecting people cognitively. So, AI can actually be a really valuable thought partner, helping people refine ideas and consider questions they might not otherwise. But we also know that it can diminish critical thinking, which is a really important thing to note when it comes to strategic and leadership oriented work. Now, I share these examples because they highlight the tremendous impact and potential impact of AI, both good and bad. And as a leader, you might be thinking, wow, these are some big picture examples. But the reality is, they ought to inform how we're thinking about leveraging AI in our teams and our organizations more broadly, specifically when it comes to considering the good and bad of AI's social and cognitive consequences. And this leads me to the big question for today. How can we make sure AI is doing more good than harm for our teams, for our organizations, for our communities, and for our world? And this is exactly what we're going to be digging into in this presentation. So, specifically, we'll explore ways to ensure AI is doing more good than harm in any kind of initiative. So, whether the project itself is really focused on launching an AI product, or if the initiative is considering leveraging AI as the part of a project, a tool to use. Now, to answer this question and provide actionable steps to ensure you're maximizing AI's benefits and minimizing its harms, I'm going to do a few things. So, let's go. So, the first thing I'm going to do is provide a quick explanation of what artificial intelligence is, especially in comparison to human intelligence. So, this is going to give us a point of reference for how AI success is typically measured. Second, we'll explore conventional ways of measuring AI success and why they don't work. And then finally, we'll review a 5 step framework that I've developed to help leverage AI for impact. So, looking forward to getting to that. And then by the end of this presentation, here's what you're going to have walked away learning. One, you'll be able to identify the gap between conventional AI success metrics and social impact measures. Two, you'll be able to understand the limitations of current responsible AI frameworks. And three, you'll be able to apply a social impact framework to evaluate AI utilization in your own team and your organization, and use that framework to help inform what you're doing going forward. Now, as I said, I want to start off with a quick level set. A brief explanation essentially of what intelligence or human intelligence is in relation to artificial intelligence. Understanding this difference is really critical to recognizing what we miss when we're only measuring AI by efficiency and cost savings. So, when we think about intelligence or human intelligence, this is really the process of living in the world, sensing or observing things, learning from these observations, building a mental model or understanding of how things work, and then applying that mental model to actually make decisions. Um, Now, in artificial intelligence, the process is similar, but the model is built differently. So you still have the real world, but instead of lived experience, data are collected and quantified as recorded observations. So these data are then used to build models via machine learning. So think of things like regression or time series analysis. And then these math models can help predict or optimize scenarios and then inform decision making. Or if you're using agentic AI, right, AI can actually make the decision for you. So the real difference here lies in the type of data and how the model is built. One is built from lived experience, and the other is built from quantifiable data. Now, in human intelligence, the model can be a lot more flexible to context because the individuals building the model have a lot of experiences to draw on and they're continuing to get new experiences every day. But in artificial intelligence, the model is always limited by whatever data have been used to train it. So you might be thinking, well, why does this distinction matter? Well, because when we evaluate AI, we tend to measure it the way we measure machines by efficiency, speed, and cost savings. But AI isn't making decisions in a vacuum, it's making real decisions that affect people and the world more broadly. So if we're only measuring what's fast and cheap, we miss not only measuring, but also responding to and mitigating any potential negative human consequences. So now I want to go on to look at what organizations are typically measuring when they adopt AI. So here are some of the key metrics that organizations and teams are most concerned with when evaluating AI cost and performance. So with costs, they'll look at data collection, data cleaning, model training, software, hardware, employees, consultants, any time required or money that needs to be spent on training staff, and then required maintenance and updates. And then to evaluate the performance, typically things will be included will be like changes in team or organizational productivity, operational efficiency or inefficiency. I say that because you never want to assume there's going to be a positive impact. I know with AI, depending on how it's been used, it's caused some inefficiencies in certain spaces and greater efficiencies in others. Of course, impact on revenue, some impact on customer satisfaction. So, especially if you're deploying a tool like an AI chatbot or personal product recommendations, employee retention, which can be a general indicator on the impact on employee experience. And then, if you're looking to this, like also decision making quality and improvement over time. Now, I'm not going to tell you these are wrong, right? All these metrics make sense, right? They're built to help us evaluate the performance of a tech tool built on math models. And these things are important. But these metrics don't tell the full story. They don't capture, for instance, the cognitive and environmental impacts that we touched on at the beginning. And we're going to dig a little deeper into in a minute. So, while AI itself is, of course, a tech tool built on quantifiable data and increasingly complex models, it's nonetheless a tool of intelligence that has really complex consequences for people and the world we live in. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, Katelyn, but isn't this what responsible AI guidelines exist for? Isn't that what these big AI companies are addressing through responsible AI policies? Perhaps, but these policies, much like conventional metrics of AI, are actually more concerned with perceived efficiency than they are with the very human consequences of AI deployment. These guidelines typically center on technical safeguards, not lived experience, community voice, or long term outcomes. So, for example, let me pull up an example here. They're focused on things like fairness. AI systems should treat all people fairly, reliability and safety, privacy and security, transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness. But what you'll notice with each of these things in this list, and this example is taken from Microsoft, it's all concerned with the system. Every single point is about the system. It's all about the technical safeguards. So that leads us to ask, well, what about when AI's use hinders creativity to the detriment of a team's performance or their overall well being? What about when AI's use damages a community's water supply or increases energy costs to a point that families are actually struggling to pay their utility bills? Responsible AI guidelines are good, they're important. I'm not going to sit here and say we don't need them, same thing as with the KPIs. But the reality is, these guidelines aren't enough when we're thinking holistically about AI's impact. Quite frankly, they fall short, which is why we need to expand our perspective to think about AI's impact beyond the conventional. Because the reality is that all businesses are social enterprises, nonprofits and for profits alike. And this is because all businesses exist in society and the choices they make have consequences for people, communities, and the environment. It's just a matter of whether they're making a positive or a negative impact. And AI, of course, is affecting people in communities in lots of different ways. And I argue that it's only in incorporating thoughtful attention to these consequences that we can implement AI in truly impactful ways, maximizing benefits and minimizing harms. So now I'm going to talk through some of the ways it's having mixed consequences already for the environment, communities, the economy, and cognitive well being. So we touched on this earlier in the presentation. We know AI is having a tremendous impact on the environment. So with respect to water consumption, we know globally that data centers are consuming an estimated 560 billion liters of water annually, and it could potentially more than double to about 1,200 billion liters by 2030. And we already know that these energy costs are being passed on to consumers. And data centers are expected to use more and more electricity by 2028. In the US, it's going to be a total of 6 to 12% of US electricity by that point, up from about 4% in 2023. And we know that these costs are going to continue to put pressure on electric bills for consumers. So related to that, thinking about communities, we're seeing some very real social consequences emerge. I think a really compelling example actually comes from college campuses, where faculty are seeing that many students rely on AI to shape all the communications they're having, not only with faculty, but also with each other, rather than learning to build those communication skills and learn from their mistakes. This, of course, has implications, not just for the workforce, but also broader community implications for how we live together. But I'll also note, there are some positive consequences that we're seeing. So across multiple studies, interacting with an AI companion chatbot has produced consistent short-term reductions in loneliness over a week's time span. So improving loneliness levels on par with actually interacting with another person. So another area of impact, of course, is economic, and AI's impact is huge. So regionally, AI economies are like booming and employing a lot of people, and that's expected to grow. But a less often discussed point of economic conversations is how AI might leave some folks behind. And I think a really powerful example of this is the increased utilization of AI to collect biodata from banking customers. So, of course, this information can really significantly reduce fraud claims for financial institutions, but at the same time can have the negative side effect of actually widening the racial wealth gap. And this is because communities that are historically or underbanked already distrust these institutions, in large part sometimes because of technology, and then requiring these use of biodata and AI to verify identities will make them even less likely to engage with financial institutions. And it's interesting, leaders in this space, in these financial institutions, do acknowledge, based on my conversations with them, the consequences of this. And I think there's a real opportunity there, and I'll talk through this later in the presentation, to do more than shrug your shoulders and say, we know it's going to happen, and actually work to mitigate that consequence. Now, the last thing I want to touch about is the cognitive consequences. So we're seeing cognitive consequences emerge, in particular in terms of critical thinking. So a recent study on cognitive offloading found a significant negative correlation between frequent AI tool use and critical thinking scores, with younger users in particular showing higher AI dependence and lower critical thinking scores than adults. In fact, I think this is really interesting. Over 40% of the time, AI users actually feel that critical thinking isn't necessary when they're using AI. I think it's also interesting to note that relying heavily on AI doesn't only stifle critical thinking, it also constrains creativity. So we know that people actually generate more original ideas when they consult AI, sometimes rather than extensively or rarely. So it's kind of all about finding that sweet spot. Now, these data and examples suggest that over reliance on AI can diminish the human intelligence we discussed before, which can have negative consequences, of course, for an individual's cognitive well being. But it can also negatively impact their work for a business, being less able to engage in rigorous, strategic, and creative decision making. And this kind of cognitive atrophy is only going to make it harder for people to address the challenges that we've just covered with respect to equity, bias, and social connection. Now, I want to note here, like, despite this big mix of impacts, I'm actually really optimistic about this moment in time as a great opportunity for leaders, for you all listening to this today, to engage more deeply in critical thinking, to encourage more critical and creative decision making on your teams, and to practice developing more strategic plans for leveraging or not leveraging emerging technologies. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, how can we actually consistently and rigorously consider these things? Specifically, all of these things that connect to the very human consequences and engagement with AI that the technical guidelines of responsible AI principles miss. So this is what we're going to talk through now, getting to my 5-step framework to understand AI's impact. Now, I want to call out, of course, we are still learning about AI and its impacts at every level. So I'm going to talk through 5 steps that you and other leaders can take to really strive to maximize the good and minimize the bad. I'll talk through them sequentially in this presentation today, but I really want to challenge and invite you all to use your own cognitive abilities and creativity to apply them the best way possible. All right, so digging in, step one. Step one is diversifying decision making. So, whether you're running a project that's squarely focused on building or launching an AI system, or you're using AI as part of a broader project, this step is really going to be the first thing you need to do. And the core question here is essentially who needs to be in the room to evaluate whether and how we move forward. Now, when beginning a project where you're focused on AI deployment, or you may use AI as a tool to achieve a larger project goal, this is when you're asking questions like, who is typically in the room for this type of project? Who might be missing from that room given the wide impact of AI on our business, on our team, on our customers? Who would be the most affected by this project? How do we want to involve them, or how are they typically involved, and what do we need here? And then what decision-making structures are we actually going to commit to having in place to ensure that diverse voices are involved throughout the project? So in action, this can look like including voices from outside of the core team. So this might be including frontline staff, actually including impacted communities, including customers, like in project kickoff, and determining together how to meaningfully include them in the process in a way that empowers but doesn't overburden them. So this includes aligning on intentional strategies to avoid convergence of thought, establishing clear decision-making frameworks for ensuring all perspectives are heard. And some key tools to do this might include things like establishing designated dissenters in meetings or leveraging anonymous question or idea sharing at different points of the discussion. So once you have your diverse stakeholders, it's really important then to see the full picture. So what do I mean by this? Well, this is why it's so important to have diverse perspectives present, because this is when you have this group, bring this group together to help you really think through the project and determine its potential impacts. So if you're leading an AI-enabled initiative, so where AI is really a tool that you're leveraging, you're still going to be deciding whether you actually want to use AI at all. And so I will say, bringing this group together, it's also important to think through, like, do we actually want to use AI here? And just because there's a lot of hype doesn't mean that it's always the best or the right tool to use. And this is especially important to note because of the many ripple effects of AI that we reviewed. So at this moment, if you're debating or sorting out whether you want to use AI at all, you need to think through, like, does this problem actually require AI, or are there better solutions? What are the harms that can emerge from using AI? What are the benefits? Do the benefits actually outweigh the harms? And if the project moves forward with an AI tool, it's important at this point to think through how the identified harms might be mitigated. So that is, how can we address these consequences, if at all? So this is the piece thinking back to the example I shared with financial institutions. Okay, we recognize that this is going to widen the racial wealth gap. So what might we want to do differently, assuming that we do want to move forward with this? It could be something like partnering with community-based organizations, providing more training for free to communities to help them understand the technology, etc. And the same thing, it's a little different. So if you have an initiative where you're actually building AI technology and that's the whole focus, and so you don't really have this moment to ask a question because it's essentially been predetermined that AI is necessary, you're really more focused on the how. So it's an opportunity here to really focus on expanding perspectives beyond the conventional by focusing on questions like, what are the potential environmental, cognitive, social, and economic impacts of using AI? What can we commit to doing to mitigate any harms? And then how can we incorporate these consequences in our project plan? So another example I'll share is that in a lot of nonprofits, there's been a big movement to focus on diversifying supply chains and decreasing environmental impacts of their businesses. So while an AI tool might be leveraged, there can also be a reinvigorated effort to reduce carbon footprints and increase green practices across sites. I'll also note that there are a lot of organizations, especially arts organizations, that are consciously choosing to not use AI because they cannot mitigate the harms that matter most to them adequately in alignment with their mission, which is an important thing to note too. So having these conversations with, seeing the full picture with these diverse perspectives is really critical, regardless of the type of project you're leading. And is a key point to really think through these different impacts we've discussed. All right, so assuming your project is moving forward with AI, the next step is to essentially measure what matters. So once the priority impact areas have been identified, this is where you're determining how you want to measure not only the conventional KPIs and metrics we talked about earlier, but also the impact measures that matter based on what you uncovered and seeing the full picture. This is going to be driven by your organization's mission, your team's focus, what matters in terms of your workforce, the communities, etc. And this is really important because if you're only tracking efficiency and productivity, you are communicating that those are the only things that matter. And you're ignoring the holistic consequences. And I think for any business, any team to be successful, you really have to think broadly. So this is essentially where you're going to be defining your success metrics. And you're going to think through, for example, what equity outcomes will you track? What environmental footprint outcomes will you track? What cognitive or social effects are you most interested in? So then working with that, diverse team that you've built, you determine the best way to measure these consequences throughout the project and align on what the key indicators might be. So this could be something like setting a goal, energy use, or anticipated cognitive performance indicator for employees. And I will say this is definitely an emerging area of best practice. No one has these metrics figured out, and they're going to look different for every business, every team, depending on what you're doing and what you're concerned about. So if you're really concerned with the impact on the workforce, you can do things like targeted pulse surveys, holding focus groups or forums for staff or customers even to share their experiences. And of course, like monitoring trends in utilization of the tool. So these are all things that you can do and kind of experiment with to figure out what makes the most sense. Another core thing that I think is often underrated with AI deployment of any type is just like what you're hearing from people in meetings, those kind of more casual conversations too. So figuring out a way to track that is helpful too. And then, of course, as you execute the project, you're going to be actively monitoring these metrics. So, are you hitting their targets? Are you seeing unintended harms emerging or unintended benefits? I think, especially with anything AI related at this point, you have to recognize like this isn't a one time definition of metrics, like it's ongoing measurement and reporting. The key thing is that you're tracking these things over time and you're identifying when there's a need to pause or reorient or change what you're focused on based on changes that you're seeing. So having a clear roadmap of like what this measurement process looks like at this stage is really important. All right, so we're going to move on to step 4 moment. So we've gathered our diverse stakeholders, we've expanded our perspectives, thought really broadly, we've identified the measures that matter and how we want to measure them. And the next thing, and this builds on what I was just sharing, is to reassess and adapt. And I'll say this is where a lot of projects, especially in AI, are going to fail. So you set up a plan, you execute it, and then you're only going to pause and reassess when something breaks. You need to do strategic reassessment. And this means building in scheduled moments to evaluate and pivot before you're in crisis mode. And it also helps make sure that what mattered at the start continues to matter. So when you're reassessing and adapting and you have these like regular checkpoints you've determined to like look at these measures and what's happening, you want to think through like, is anybody being impacted in ways that we hadn't anticipated? What does that look like? What's good? What's bad? Are we still actually measuring what matters? Do new things matter for our organization? Like, have these measurements brought things to the front that we hadn't expected? Has our organizational focus changed? Do we need to shift what we're measuring? How do we need to adjust our project given what we've learned so far? So, like, do you want to use more AI? Do you want to use less AI? Do you want to shift how things are rolling out? Like, how are you going to have these conversations? And are we expecting anything different for the remainder of the project given what we've learned so far? So I'll say on teams that I've led, we've monitored this use in our weekly team meetings because we were pretty actively sorting out how to best use AI. And that allowed us to understand the impact of how, using AI is helping or hurting our workflows and the quality of our work. And then we kind of make on the fly adjustments to our standards and policies around AI use to reflect what we're learning and how we're working. So with any kind of project, having a roadmap for when you're going to have these reassessment and adapting conversations is important. And then identifying like what are the key questions you want to think through at each point, which could be the ones that I just shared or figuring out others that are more relevant for your project. Now, the last step is step 5. And this is where you're going to be expanding perspectives. And this can happen in a couple of ways in your project. Let me get this slide up. There we go. So the first way this happens is by, reviewing and incorporating emerging insights about AI's impact and implications from external sources. And 2, it's actually by applying what you've learned in the project, especially with those internal metrics, to adjust broader organizational processes based on what you've learned. So with respect to bringing into the fold external perspectives, this should ideally happen throughout the project, where you're intentionally integrating new information about AI's impact. And this is especially important because we're really rapidly learning about AI. And I would recommend doing check-ins on the broader consequences and alternate solutions, probably at least every other month. And this will vary by project timeline. And be really clear about, how a significant change or new evidence from research impacts the project. Who's going to have the authority to make that call and whose perspectives, from those diverse stakeholders are really going to drive that decision. And here's where we're going to think about things like, what's new in the world of AI? What new social, environmental, cognitive consequences have emerged? Are there any new harms that you have learned about that we should know? What are ways we can mitigate those harms that we hadn't previously considered? And are there any perspectives that are missing? Is there anyone, based on what we're hearing from the outside world, what's happening with AI more broadly, anyone who's been excluded from the decisions that we've made that we now think should be included? And how do we weave them in? And this is really important because there's a lot of new research coming out about AI all the time. Now, once any kind of initiative is done, this is the real opportunity to apply everything you've learned from the project to the organization as a whole. So, like, what did you learn? Whose voices were missing? What would you do differently next time in leading this kind of project? So, really documenting those lessons learned and helping your organization learn from these decision making lessons to inform future projects. So, did things go as intended? What would you do differently? And how would you recommend people take these learnings and apply them in their own projects going forward? I'll say, kind of in this line with expanded perspectives, I'll give an example from my own work, especially teaching. So I actually cut back pretty significantly on my own personal AI use and professional AI use, and advise my team members to do the same based on what I learned through teaching my students. I gave them an assignment that they first did by hand, and then they did the same thing using AI. And the thing that really surprised me is that it was difficult for students who'd been using AI a lot to see how AI wasn't producing as high a quality work in many respects as what they were able to produce fully independently. So this made me step back and kind of rethink how I was using AI myself. And I know it's done the same for a lot of my students, because it's kind of seeing, oh, if you're using this too much, right? It gets to this, like, those creativity research findings. It's not as good, and it's harder to judge kind of what these generative AI LLMs are generating in the way that you want to make sure you're producing high quality work. So as a result, like, I'm far less likely to assume AI is a good solution because of what I've learned from research and from my experience of teaching in the classroom. And I've applied that in my own work and with my team. The main thing here is that it's really important to be intentional about when and how adjustments about AI use happen. And that's going to vary by project scope. So to wrap this all up, I want to underscore this framework is really more than a checklist you complete once. It's intended to be a practice woven into how you're doing work, how you're engaging with AI, and really a guide to ensure you're all remaining curious and learning throughout the projects that you're leading. So I hope that these are some of the key takeaways you have from this practice. So one, you want to start with who benefits and who's harmed. You want to make sure you're measuring what really matters. You want to keep learning and adapting as you apply this practice to the projects that you're managing. And by doing this, you can be a critically engaged leader with AI and strive to ensure that technology's good outweighs its bad, and that ultimately it has more of a good impact than a bad one. So I want to thank you all so much for your time. If you're interested in having more conversations, or you want to further engage, like, how you can make sure you're using AI strategically and for good, please reach out. I'm happy to be a resource. I'd love to support you in that quest. I've also included a QR code here. So if you want to subscribe to my newsletter where I write about these things, please do that. And again, don't hesitate to connect on LinkedIn or reach out. So I'll leave that for a moment in case you're interested. I'll also share, these are some of the sources that I used in this presentation. And here are the questions that the organizers of this conference asked me to address in the presentation. So they were covered in the earlier content, but if you're curious, these are the questions that are posed that I covered. Again, thank you so much for your time. Please don't hesitate to reach out.